Welcome back, guys. Let's jump straight into another semi-formal letter here. Let's read out the task. You are working on a project with a work colleague. However, you do not think you will finish in time to meet the deadline. Write a letter to your colleague. In your letter, describe details of the project, say why you cannot meet the deadline, and suggest a new deadline. Seems like a pretty simple task here. Let's go through the keywords to make sure that we address all of the key requirements. So you are working on a project. So we know that it's a project. We need to reference the fact that it's a project that we're working on with a work colleague. Okay, so you're working with the colleague here, and you do not think that you will finish in time to meet the deadline. So there's a specific deadline that's been set. We don't think we're going to meet it. That verb think is actually quite important. It's not that you're absolutely certain that you'll not meet the deadline, but that is the current feeling at the moment. So we can reference that as well. We want to write a letter to the colleague. Bear in mind, you're not writing to your boss, you're writing to your colleague, presumably an equal. Your boss can be a colleague at the same time, but it doesn't need to be. It could be someone on the same level as you. And in your letter, describe details of the project. So we need to give some details about the project. We've got to be careful here because they're working with us on the project, we have to think about the details that they may not be aware of. Say why you cannot meet the deadline, or that you think you cannot meet the deadline. And then we want to suggest a new deadline. So this seems like a relatively simple task. What we might find a little bit difficult is fleshing it out, because we are relatively short on instructions. There's not much to go on here. We may struggle to flesh out some ideas, but we'll go through it, and I'll be able to show you how we can take some brief ideas and develop them, strengthen them, illustrate them, give them a little bit of give them a bit of weight. So we first of all need to think about the purpose of the letter. We know we're in a semi-formal letter because we are writing to a colleague. Now, first thing, you may argue that this should have a formal tone. If you were to write in a formal tone, you would not be wrong. As long as you are consistent throughout, there is no problem with writing in a formal tone. You're in a business setting. I wouldn't write in an informal tone. I don't really think that's appropriate. But if you're working with a colleague, you're not writing to the customer. You're not necessarily writing to your superior, to your boss. If you're writing to a colleague, it can take on a slightly more casual tone, but don't make it too casual, don't make it overly personal. But semi-formal is okay in this setting. As for the purpose, what do you think? We're working on a project, we don't think we're going to finish to meet it in time, and then we have these instructions. For me, there is an element of an apology letter here, but at no point in the instructions are we asked to actually apologize. It's not our fault necessarily that we won't meet the deadline on time. It might be. If it is our fault, it's probably recommended to apologize. But if it is not our fault, we don't necessarily need to apologize. We may apologize in a general way for the inconvenience, but there's more of an element of an explanation here. It's more of an explanation letter, but with an apology tone coming through here as well. So the main purpose is to explain something, but we may take on an apologetic tone in some of the vocabulary that we use as well. And you'll see that operating as we go through this model answer. Let's think about the plan, and as always we want these four paragraphs based on the 3 bullet points. And the first one is that we want to describe details of the project. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, this is a bit complicated because we are working on the project with the colleague. We have that preposition with here. That's quite important. We don't want to give him unnecessary details. We can maybe suggest that we're working on one part of the project, they are working on a different part of the project so that means that they may not be aware of what we're doing. Let's imagine we are designing a particular product. I don't know what that product might be, but the project is to design the product, and our part of the product is working on, let's say, the battery module, something like that. So we are working on this part of the project and they are working on a different part of the project. We may just want to emphasize that distinction and talk about the fact that their side is going fine. So your, let's say, side of the project, we understand that it might have been completed or it's nearing completion or everything's going well. And in general, everything with the project is going well except for this one thing. And that's how we can transition into saying why we think we can't meet the deadline. We'll focus specifically on this element of the battery module, and we can say something like there is, in order to design the module, in order to produce it, there is something that we need and we don't have it. Maybe there is a particular component that is out of stock at the supplier and we cannot get it in time. What have we done to rectify the situation? Maybe we have written to the supplier, so we can just write written to supplier and we've asked them about it, but there's no guarantee that it's going to come in. But we can see here that this is why we would not be able to meet the deadline, because we literally cannot create the product without it. And so in then paragraph 4, we suggest a new deadline. So if we can't meet it, so again, remember, we think we won't finish it in time, but if we can't meet it, then we will need to suggest that we push it. We can use the expression push the deadline back. So push deadline back. That's quite nice for a semi-formal letter, using language like push a deadline back by, let's say, I don't know, 2 weeks. 2 weeks, and that should give enough time for the component to appear in the store, and then we can buy it and use it and complete the project. So that can be enough for our plan here. I think that should provide us with enough details to flesh out. So let's leave that over here, and we can then move on to the letter itself. Now, dear, how do we go about the name here? Again, as I said, if you're writing it in a formal tone, it is okay to write dear Mr., dear Mrs., dear Miss, and then the surname. But equally, you are also okay to write someone's first name. If you're writing to a colleague, you got to think about the fact that many different companies operate in many different ways. None of them, well, very few of them, particularly if you're working on a project, there won't be many that will be extremely informal, but many of them will be more informal than others. And because of that, we do get away with writing in a semi-formal tone, and we just need to be consistent with that. So I'm going to go with this semi-formal tone here and just write a first name. So we'll just say Dear James. Dear James. And then we want to jump straight into the purpose of the letter, make it very clear that we are explaining and apologizing potentially, or at least explaining with an apologetic tone what is about to happen or what is about to not happen. So I am writing, remember no contractions. So essentially here what we're doing is giving a warning. Warning is a type of explanation, but specifically it's a warning. So let's write to warn you, or even better, to give you warning. Not a warning, you can write that, but give you warning. Give you warning that, now here's the apologetic tone. Unfortunately, notice those 2 commas. You can remove those commas if you wish. This just includes a sense of a pause either side of the word unfortunately, just as you might say it if you were speaking out loud. I'm writing to give you warning that, unfortunately, I may be unable. Notice the word formation here, not be able. It's okay to write that, but unable shows your ability to use prefixes correctly. I may be unable to finish, and let's give it a name. Any random numbers there. The A605 project before the deadline, or the original deadline, this already indicates that we may need to change the deadline. We're setting that up for later. So I'm writing to give you warning that unfortunately I may be unable to finish the A605 project before the original deadline. You can even change the I to a we. This does not imply responsibility on James's part. It's just that it acknowledges the fact that you're working on the project together with someone, and so everyone on that project will technically be unable to finish the project if one person doesn't get their part done. So you can also write that. So I'm writing to give you warning that unfortunately we may be unable to finish the A605 project before the original deadline. Now that we may suggest a bit of blame to you for the other person, and that's a bit unfair. So we want to make it very clear in the next paragraph that the other person does not hold any of the blame. And we'll do that when we come to this, your side is complete, and we're acknowledging that. But we can start at the beginning by talking about what we're working on. We're working on this battery module. So at the moment, again, that's the right kind of tone for semi-formal. At present or currently might be more appropriate for a formal letter. The focus of the project on my side, just to be clear, is the focus on the project on my side is on the battery module. Nice and simple, very clear though, nice collocation, battery module. Now we want to come to your side is complete, and just generally talking about the project away from us. From what I understand. From what I understand. So as far as I understand is another expression you can use as well. Just means from what I've been told, from all the information I have, this is what I know. From what I understand, the rest of the project is, now this again, appropriate for a semi-formal letter, going smoothly. If it were a formal letter, you might write something like progressing according to schedule. If it were an informal letter, you might write something like moving along nicely, but going smoothly is okay for the semi-formal. And again, like from what I understand, similar, I think I am correct in saying that, and then we come to this part here, your side of the project, we could write is complete, or we could be a little bit more grammatically advanced and show our ability to use the present perfect passive, has recently been completed. So just a little bit more range here. Your side of the project has recently been completed. That seems okay to me. So we've made it very clear that it is not the other person's fault, despite the fact we've written we up here. We just mean that that's the reality of the situation. The team won't be able to finish it as a unit. And then we can move on to the explanation of why we can't meet the deadline. So the very clear purpose, the explanation. And let's just introduce it. Like we've done before, the reason is that, the story is that, what happened was that. This makes a very clear introduction to the fact we're going to either include a story or write an explanation or give a reason. We're introducing the purpose of the paragraph very clearly here. So the issue is that, now so again, some apologetic language, some language that suggests something's gone wrong, frustratingly. Like unfortunately, tucked between those two commas, you can do the same thing here with this adverb frustratingly. So the issue is that, frustratingly, an essential component, notice that adjective there, it's absolutely essential, means we can't complete the project without it, for the module is currently, as we can see, out of stock with our supplier. Notice I'm not saying the supplier, but our supplier, because we're trying to move more into a more formal setting now. The supplier, you probably wouldn't write the supplier in an informal letter anyway, because it wouldn't come up. But notice that we're starting to use more possessive pronouns rather than definite articles. So specific to that business with our supplier. And okay, so we want to stress the fact it can't be completed without the component. So without this component, and without this component it will not be possible, or like we did with unable rather than not be able, how could we change that around? It will be not un, but impossible. Again, showing a little bit of word formation, prefix understanding. It will be impossible for the project to be completed on time. Okay, the project to be completed on time. I think that's okay for the sentence there. So let's finish that and then move on to the next one, where we explain what we're trying to do to fix the situation. We've talked about written to the supplier. So let's move, again, create a bit of range here. Let's move into the present perfect. I have contacted the supplier. You could write I contacted the supplier as well, but with the implication with have contacted is that the result of the past, this thing that you did in the past, still impacts something in the present. So we contacted them in the past and we're waiting for a response. All of that together is why we use the present perfect. So it's that combination of past and present. I have contacted the supplier, nice expression here, to express the urgency of the situation. Express the urgency of the situation. This is becoming a little bit more formal, a bit more business language. So you can use it in a semi-formal letter, but the more appropriate thing here is the topic. The topic is related to work, related to deadlines, and so we're using that topic-related vocabulary that's important to achieve a Band 7 and above. So to express the urgency of the situation. And now what's happening? I, again, will move the tense here. This is why I've got the comma here as well. We do need, if we use a comma and we don't change the subject, then it's important that you repeat the subject. But the main reason that I am separating these clauses is because I'm moving the grammatical tense here. I am currently waiting, which is the present continuous, on their response. Notice I'm using their response to reference the supplier, not its response. When we think of a supplier, we think about a group of people, like a team, and in that case we usually go with their. So that's that paragraph done, and we can now move on to the suggestion of a new deadline. The first thing we want to point out again is that we only think we won't finish in time, but hopefully, and that's how I'm going to start the paragraph, hopefully we will finish on time. Hopefully the supplier will have good news for us. Here you're skirting the line between semi-formal and informal, but I think it's appropriate. I think this is okay. This does fall within the realms of a semi-formal letter. So hopefully the supplier will have good news for us. But if not, I will have to suggest. So I'll be forced to suggest. You could also write here, but forced to sounds a bit aggressive, so we can just say have to. I will have to suggest that we, here we go, this plan over here, push the deadline back by 2 weeks. If this were a formal letter, instead of push the deadline back, you might write something like we extend the deadline by 2 weeks, that we delay the deadline by 2 weeks. But in a semi-formal letter, push the deadline back is perfectly fine. In fact, it's appropriate, and it will boost your score probably more than those other two verbs. So push the deadline back by 2 weeks. Let's write down one more sentence here. What is the result of pushing the deadline back 2 weeks? Why 2 weeks? Well, this is because this should allow enough time. What's the whole purpose here? The component and the supplier. So for the component to come back into stock, could write that. Again, think about your word formation. Think about your prefixes. To be restocked. Okay, so you've got the passive voice and you've got this prefix here, so you're showing lexical range and you're showing grammatical range at the same time. So for the component to be restocked and then delivered, and the project to be completed. In fact, I'm going to go back and add a preposition here. This is slightly separate from this, so I'm going to add another for just to emphasize that. So you've got enough time for the component to be restocked and delivered and enough time for the project to be completed. That's why you would use that preposition again, just to emphasize that there is some separation in the ideas. And that seems to be okay to me. Now, you can, if you want to finish up with, I apologize for any inconvenience this might cause. Personally, I'm just going to look at the word count here. It's already looking quite long to me. I would want to save a bit of time. If you had the time, sure, go ahead and add, I apologize for any inconvenience this might cause. But if you don't add that, it's perfectly fine. An apology is not part of the task requirements, but it would make sense to add it as well, so you wouldn't lose points for adding it. Personally, I'm just going to add a best regards. Best regards, remember adding the regards if it's semi-formal, and then just a first name, because I've just gone with the first name above, but notice it's not Andy, it's not a short form, but it's the full name Andrew. More appropriate for a semi-formal letter. Okay, so it's quite clear that we've covered all of the task requirements here. We've described details of the project. We've said why we think we can't meet the deadline. We've suggested a new deadline. It's clear we've referenced the fact we're working with a colleague. So everything's covered here. The letter runs smoothly from beginning to end. The vocabulary is appropriate not only to the topic but also to the purpose, and the tone is appropriate and consistent throughout. So everything's covered. You can now look at the gap fill exercise and then join me in the next lecture.